Today's sponsor is Blue Chew, and they're giving you your first shipment totally free. All you have to do is pay $5 for shipping. Go to bluechew.com, use promo code DAVID. I've put the link right underneath this video. Here's a question that seems pretty basic and pretty simple, but it's really not quite so straightforward. How does an economic recession or depression end? In other words, we know that they happen and we know that eventually they end. But what is the mechanism exactly? We might be in a recession right now. We could be heading into a depression right now. This could extend for months or years. Some are saying to some degree we are going to have very high unemployment for several years. At some point, what we are in will end, unless this is the end of planet Earth. How does it all end? We know that we have a lot of self-fulfilling prophecies that can get us into a recession. But can those same self-fulfilling prophecies get us out? Now, this is not, when we say that something has ended, this is not about the statistic that tells us we are out of the recession or the depression. We can argue about that, and some people would say, well, it's based on GDP. GDP tells you when you're out of a recession. What I'm talking about is not how can we tell when we're out. I'm talking about what is the mechanism that gets an economy out of a recession or a depression. Is it that we see more hiring and unemployment goes down? Is it that the stock market goes up and makes people confident? Is it just people's confidence in and of itself? Which is a cause versus an effect? These are not simple economic questions. And what you really need are two major things to get out of an economic downturn. First, the cause of the downturn needs to be clearly resolved. And then number two, you need a combination of economic policy and business conditions to start an actual recovery in terms of the numbers. But you also need consumer sentiment to change. This is a reality in economies like ours that are heavily driven by the perception of their own state. And that is that people fearing a recession, starting to spend less can precipitate one, but also people feeling as though the situation has been resolved and starting to spend more and demand more in and of itself can help to get us out of a recession. So yeah, people feeling like the recession is over is a big part of the recession being over, and it can seem recursive or endlessly regressive. This is arguably not good about our economic system. I think it's important to understand that so much of how we are doing as an economy is about how people believe that we are doing. But for now, this is our system, and consumer sentiment is part of getting out of a depression, because when people believe we are out or soon to be out, they start acting as though we are out, which gets us out because people start spending and demanding goods and services. So let's think back to 2008, okay, the Great Recession of 2008. Two things happened to stop that recession and to get us out of it. Number one, the underlying issue, which was the fear of huge financial institutions being insolvent as a result of the mortgage crisis and some other reasons, that was resolved sort of, in the sense that we had some new regulations. We had the belief that we've put in place new lending guidelines, so the mortgage crisis can't happen again. We've cleaned up some corruption, supposedly, even though nobody went to jail. But the point is, there was the belief that the underlying cause had been resolved. That was a big part of it. In addition, though, we had a lot of economic policy response under the Obama administration that got us out. That included that huge stimulus package that Republicans were furious about that Barack Obama did. It included new government spending. It included some tax cuts. So that was 2008. The difference now with the current recession, or what some are saying is an inevitable depression that's coming related to coronavirus, is that it is not a financial institution recession in principle. What we have here is a coronavirus pandemic, which decimated demand for stuff. Because of the pandemic, because of the virus, demand for travel went down 95% in some cases. Demand for office space collapsed. Demand for restaurants collapsed. All of that stuff. So the resolution to this one is not about government spending money or sending people cash. Government needs to do that as a stopgap so that people don't starve or lose their homes or lose their cars or lose their businesses that they hope to go back to. But the underlying issue here to be solved is a medical issue. We need treatment. We need a vaccine. So for now, government's role is a little bit different in this recession than it was in 2008. Government needs to provide support for people to keep them and businesses afloat in a sort of waiting period. It's a bridge in a sense. Once the underlying issue, the virus, is resolved, demand in principle should start to recover. Now, it's only going to recover in proportion to people's ability to demand things. Now, when we say demand, we're talking about it economically. I can demand a private jet in the sense that it sounds cool. But when I talk about economic demand, it means that there is actually the money with which to demand these things in an economic system. So as people feel safe going to restaurants, they will go to restaurants, and the restaurants will make money. They'll pay employees. They'll buy stuff from food supply companies. The employees will go out and spend money at other local businesses. The food supply companies, seeing more demand from restaurants, will start ordering more food from producers, and the economic activity will resume. Traveling will, then increase. But increased air travel will mean that people are going to be places they don't live, which means they will demand hotel stays, and on and on and on. Now, a reasonable question would be, and one that we should be asking, is there a way to prevent these recessions in the first place? Now, preventing them altogether is tough. And there's a difference between a medically based recession like coronavirus and something like we saw in 2008, the financial crisis. There is no doubt that we could organize economies in a way that would soften these recessions and make them less severe. There are some realities about our economic system. There are booms and busts. That's how capitalism works. And we have a capitalism in the United States that is not nearly regulated enough. There's no incentive in systems like ours to be proactive. Proactive means you're spending money you might not need to spend, and you're reducing your profits in the immediate. Being proactive is not incentivized by the system that we have. We are reactive. So when the boom turns to a bust, it's really big and a ton of people suffer greatly. In the last 3 months, we learned about this. Many systems that feel strong, low unemployment, high stock market, high consumer confidence, looked like a very strong infrastructure. It was really quite fragile. In about a 2-week period, it imploded. If all along we had a more solid infrastructure, we would suffer not nearly as much during these downturns. So for example, if everybody had healthcare not connected to their employer, losing a job during a pandemic would be less of a crisis. It would still be a crisis, but it would be less of a crisis if health insurance was not tied to employment. Another example, if we had universal basic income or something like it, jobs guarantee, whatever flavor you like, the loss of jobs or reductions in wages would be less problematic. It wouldn't be irrelevant, but it would be less urgently problematic. And the government would not be in as much of a position of acutely having to figure out, we got to start sending out checks, direct deposits, prepaid debit cards, all this different stuff. It would be less of a crisis. So the lesson that hopefully we would learn here is we can't prevent a future pandemic from a novel virus. Could happen again. It likely will happen again. We can't prevent any up and down in the economy, even if we insure by putting in different insurance policies. There are business cycles and there are going to be ups and downs. But what social democrats like me want is more investment from the fruits of when things are going well to put in place social insurance policies that will raise the standard of living for everybody, get more people off of that borderline paycheck to paycheck situation where if you don't work for 2 weeks, you now are unable to meet your basic expenses. Let's make the system less fragile for when things like this happen in the future. Okay, if you are protesting now or if you plan to protest someday, you should really know your rights. What is the law and what is beyond the law so that you can be prepared to advocate for yourself and others if you see protesters' rights being violated, and so that you can remain safe. Now, I know I don't even have to say this, but of course, if you break the law, including by damaging property or attacking people, you are at risk of getting arrested and of getting the crap kicked out of you, by the way things seem to be going with police. And nothing in this video is meant to help people break the law. The point is to understand the law and understand what you're legally allowed to do. So first of all, the core of this is that the First Amendment of to the Constitution of the United States grants you the right to assemble and to use your voice to protest. Using your voice includes things like holding signs as well. It is legal for law enforcement to ban protesters from certain physical spaces. For example, if law enforcement says you can't walk on the highway to protest, and there's already, most states have rules against walking on the highway anyway, and you do it, you can get arrested for that. If there is a curfew and you ignore it to protest, you can get arrested. Where things get tricky is in the gray area. When you have 99% of a protest being peaceful and 1% starts breaking the law, the police do have the right to clear the entire protest, and you can get arrested even if you weren't doing anything wrong. If after police have said it's time to go, you stick around. Now, police are not supposed to immediately start arresting and tear gassing and hitting people with batons. If they say protest has to end, they wait 5 seconds and they start beating the crap out of people. They're supposed to provide a reasonable amount of time for people to get out of the area. And if you are clearly walking away, you also should not be bothered or attacked by police. Now, this is, as you can imagine, dangerous because these rules can be misused. Police can incite a couple of people to break the law to then justify clearing an entire protest. That's a way in which police can misuse these rules. But understand that when part of a protest has gone bad, legally, I'm not saying morally, legally, police can clear the entire area. Now, in terms of where you can protest, I mentioned highways could be off limits. That would not be considered a limitation of your First Amendment rights if police say you can't walk on the highway and do your protest there. There are states that require permits if you're going to be in the street or sometimes on the sidewalk if you're not going to be moving and you're going to be blocking traffic. Now, pedestrian traffic. Generally, you do not need permits to protest while walking along sidewalks or even in streets sometimes if you are not obstructing traffic. Depends on the state. It's very hard to protest on a road without obstructing traffic. So the road protests almost always do need a permit. Generally speaking, public spaces can be protest locations. That includes sidewalks and parks and the like. Doesn't mean you can do it without a permit in some states. You must know the laws of your state. Anytime that you block the passage of people or cars, and this includes on sidewalks, you can be arrested if you refuse to move. Understand that. And again, this can be misused by police. Police will sometimes say you're blocking pedestrian traffic and then say, and because of that, it's time to wrap it up. And then you stay and you get arrested, even though traffic may not actually have been blocked. Police are supposed to provide a reasonable opportunity to comply, and that includes sufficient time and a clear, unobstructed exit path. We had reports from yesterday that protesters were sort of corralled onto one of the bridges in between Manhattan and Brooklyn, I believe the Manhattan Bridge, and that would be in violation of, if you say it's time to go, you have to provide an unobstructed exit path and time to exit. Now, this means that they can't say the party's over and within 15 seconds start arresting people, but it is sometimes misused by police to claim we issued a dispersal order and they didn't move. Quick note about government buildings. Government buildings can be exceptions. They're sort of public buildings in a sense. That doesn't mean you can necessarily protest inside, and that varies by state. Very important. If you want to show up and record with your phone or with a camera or whatever, you can record what is going on in public, and you can record police no matter what they tell you. Again, the trick to watch out for is that if by recording you are impeding police where you've decided to stand, if you're getting in the way of what police are doing, they can argue you are interfering with police, you're obstructing law enforcement. As you can imagine, that can also be misused, and you can find examples of police saying that somebody who's really not obstructing is obstructing by virtue of where they're standing to record. The advice we generally see is stand on the sidewalk to record. If the altercation is happening on the sidewalk, make sure that you're not in the way of police. Now, in terms of recording, you are also protesting in a public space, meaning you can be recorded, your picture can be taken, Your face could be published in media without your consent. Understand that when you go to a protest, you're not starting an altercation because someone's filming you, but they do film you and then that is used somewhere. That is legal because you are out in public at a protest. Police do have pretty broad rights to maintain law and order and uphold local laws. And this can sometimes be misapplied to filming. Be aware, police can't tell you that you have to turn over your phone. They can't force you to show them stuff on your phone. They need a warrant signed by a judge in order to do that. Now, if police approach you because you are recording, certainly remind the police that recording in a public space is, number one, of course, legal, and number two, does not count as reasonable suspicion to believe you have committed a crime. In other words, if police say they're approaching you because you're acting suspiciously and all you're doing is filming does not count as reasonable suspicion. If you do break the law and get arrested, the normal search and seizure rules would apply. If police tell you you've got to delete a video from your phone, that is not a lawful order from police and you don't have to do it. If police want to search your backpack or your wallet or your fanny pack before or after an arrest, you're under no obligation to allow it. And you can even say, I do not consent to a search of my property. Police typically are allowed to pat you down. In some states, you do have to give police your name, but you are not required to give any other information. Remember, counter protesters that might not agree with you also have free speech rights, and police are supposed to treat both protesters and counter protesters equally. According to the ACLU, police are permitted, if they identify antagonistic groups, police are permitted to keep those groups separated, but they should allow them to be within sight and sound of each other. Otherwise, you're not really able to protest. You're not really able to counter protest if you can only do it out of earshot and visible range of the people you are protesting. So then a few notes on police interactions. If police approach you and want to talk to you, you don't have to talk to them. Don't resist, of course. It's better not to run away, but simply ask, am I being detained or am I free to go? If they say you are not free to go, you are able to inquire, what is the crime I'm suspected of having committed that has caused you to detain me? If you do get arrested, you also don't have to say anything. Again, in some states, you do have to state your name, but in many states, you don't. The degree of cooperation you want to exhibit is up to you. Depends on what you've been doing, depends on your priorities. At any time, you can ask for a lawyer, and they are required to provide you one. Now, can you be fired by your employer for being at a protest, even if you didn't do anything illegal, even if your participation is protected by the Constitution? Unfortunately, the answer is it depends. It depends on the state you live and work in. It depends on what kind of job you have. It depends on what kind of agreement you have in place with your employer, if you have one. A lot of people don't really have such agreements. And that one is more complicated, and you should really discuss it with a lawyer or legal aid service. But there are many circumstances in which your employer can dismiss you merely for having participated in a constitutionally protected protest. Very important to understand the law and your rights when it comes to that. Let me know if I missed anything important. Make sure you are following me on Twitter at dpacman, and make sure you're subscribed to the Daily Audio Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Play, or anywhere you prefer to get your podcast. We'll take a quick break and be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
This episode was sponsored by Blue Chew, giving my viewers their first shipment totally free when you go to bluechew.com and use promo code DAVID. It's just a reality that many men, regardless of age, can sometimes benefit from a boost in confidence, a little bit of performance help. Blue Chew is the first chewable tablet with the same FDA-approved ingredients as Viagra and Cialis. Blue Chew being a chewable tablet means it starts working twice as fast as a pill. It's prescribed online. You spend a couple minutes with a short questionnaire. A licensed doctor reviews the information, decides if a prescription is right for you. It's then shipped directly to your home in discreet packaging. No awkward visits to the doctor's office or pharmacy. Plus, it's also cheaper than getting it at a pharmacy. When you go to bluechew.com and use promo code David, you will get your first shipment completely free. Just pay $5 shipping. That's promo code David to get your first shipment of Blue Chew completely free. And I've put the link right underneath this video.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are April Braddock and Michelle Metz. Thanks to April and Michelle for the support. Also, a big thank you to David Fedak, who has been a member for almost 5 years and is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. I have to tell you about something interesting that's happened in the last 48 hours. I received a bunch of emails and tweets from people saying, you know, David, I wasn't planning to vote for Biden because he's not a progressive. I don't believe in choosing the lesser of two evils. But after Donald Trump's authoritarian nightmare of a declaration on Monday night about deploying the military to states, I realize I have to vote for Joe Biden. These last 72 or so hours from Donald Trump, for many of my viewers, have become a breaking point. Now, I don't want you to write to me. I don't need you to write to me and say, not me, David. I'm still never voting for Biden. Okay, I'm not talking about you. What I'm telling you is that I have seen nothing since the start of this election that has triggered so many emails from people saying I was not on board with Biden for this reason or for that reason. But over the last 3 days, I've realized I have to vote for Biden in November because this has gone too far. Check out some of the tweets that were sent to me. Here's one, quote, I despise Biden and the Democrats, still do, but at least he won't try to label millions of our citizens as terrorists and sick the military on us. I will crawl over broken glass to vote for him in the fall. Another tweet, quote, I've been a Bernie supporter before people knew he existed, yet I am vote blue to save America 2020. As a history professor, I've seen this before. When you have a chance to halt fascism, you do it, then fight for a leftist push. Question, what will we do when Trump refuses to leave the White House? Another tweet saying, quote, same here, that press conference BS was the nail in the coffin. So listen, this is logical. We are now seeing this nascent authoritarianism come full circle. And I want to add something that somebody tweeted to me that I believe is very important in the context of this conversation. I got a tweet which said, quote, they need to be encouraged and not shamed. And that is exactly right. We were never going to shame people out of sitting aside in November. It wasn't going to work. I've been talking about the futility of voter shaming for several weeks, if not months now. And I'm not going to shame them now. I have no interest in doing this I told you so stuff with the Never Biden folks who are realizing this is a crisis and we've got to remove Trump. What I'm going to say is I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled. And I knew you would come around. You are seeing the reality of the situation for what it is. Let's get together and defeat Donald Trump. I'm glad to have you. No shame here. No, I told you so here. None of this stuff. I encourage everybody to do the exact same thing. I know, the YouTube comments, people will say, David, you're so stupid. I'm always never Biden. I'm not talking about you. And we don't need everyone. We just need some people to realize staying home is not okay right now. We need to remove Donald Trump. If the last 72 hours haven't made that sickeningly clear, then I don't know that there's anything left that would convince you. And in fact, I think, again, without shame, with total peace and love and curiosity, I would go back to the folks that are still never Biden and say, I want to engage with you. Now that Donald Trump has continued this authoritarian slide, what else do you need to say, I've got to do it. I've got to vote for Biden. Is it some specific policy position? Is there anything Trump could do that would get you to say, okay, now he's clearly bad enough that I'm going to vote for Biden rather than staying home or voting third party or whatever? I want to hear from you, and I hope that you will let me know. Donald Trump has been tweeting attacks on protesters from the White House. for days while offering up a suggestion that the military go in and use more force against protesters. Meanwhile, Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden has been meeting with protesters. He gave a very good speech yesterday about the state of the race as well as police relations in this country. And we now have Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren joining the protest marches yesterday, marching with her husband and her absolutely delightful dog, a golden retriever named Bailey. Here is Warren marching, of course, with a mask, asked by a protester, why is Donald Trump bringing in the military? Warren says because he's wrong. People are protesting peacefully. Check it out. It is a little bit difficult to understand all of the audio because people are wearing masks, but I think you're going to get the gist of it.
For you. Why does Trump got the military out here? Why does he got?
Because he's wrong.
He's racist.
He is imposing violence on our people. People are here to protest peacefully.
Let me do it, y'all.
Elizabeth Warren not being shy about what is going on. She tweeted on Monday, quote, "The president of the United States tear-gassed peaceful protesters in order to clear the way for a useless photo op outside the White House just after vowing to activate the military against our own people. Lives and democracy are in danger." I like this. Okay, she's a senator. She's not going to say everything you or I would necessarily say, but she's being strong and clear here. And how about Bailey the dog at the protests? It really just doesn't get better than a nice dog joining a movement for sanity and reason. So what's going on with Warren as VP? You all know last week I interviewed Congressman Ro Khanna, and he said he believes Warren is the best choice for VP. Joe Biden is increasingly getting pressure not to pick Elizabeth Warren from different camps, okay? There are some people who don't want Warren to be the VP because they don't like her wealth tax and they don't want her wealth tax to be made into the law. The reality is that Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax is very unlikely to be made into the law, even if Elizabeth Warren is vice president. Please understand that it's not even clear Joe Biden supports that. There's another contingent that wants Joe Biden to choose a black vice president. Now, remember, Joe Biden already committed to choosing a female vice president. Yesterday on the bonus show, we talked about the call for Joe Biden now to pick a black female vice president. I believe that the top choices in terms of who's likely to get it for a black female VP would be Kamala Harris and maybe Val Demings. Now, Kamala Harris is hugely problematic because of her actions as California Attorney General. Given what's going on right now with the protests, it strikes me as maybe a bad idea to pick Kamala Harris. If in 2 months the protests have died down, maybe it's something that would be less problematic from a PR perspective, although her track record as California AG is not good. Val Demings, on the other hand, would be an interesting choice. She's a congresswoman from Florida with is it Florida or Georgia? Now, I believe it's Florida, with a law enforcement background. And I think that that would be a very interesting pick. Now, there are people talking about Nina Turner or Stacey Abrams. I know not everybody in my audience knows who they are. I don't see it as even remotely likely that Joe Biden picks Nina Turner or Stacey Abrams. So let me know your thoughts. Who do you think Biden is most likely to select versus who would you like Joe Biden to select? Interested in hearing from you. You can let me know on Twitter @DPacman. Okay, a little bit of election news. I have really good news for people. Disgusting extremist ideologue, right-winger Congressman Steve King from Iowa from Indiana, lost his Republican primary Iowa, lost his primary yesterday and is being kicked out of Congress in January. This is truly a disgusting guy. And I am so glad in the midst of just terrible things going on in our country to be able to tell you about something good that has taken place. They voted yesterday. Steve King has been ousted by State Senator Randy Feenstra. King has a history of racially toxic comments. He once waxed nostalgic about how the term white supremacist didn't used to be offensive. He is irrationally anti-immigrant. He once compared immigrants to dogs and dirt. In 2013, he said that young documented immigrants have, this is a quote, calves the size of cantaloupes because they haul 75 pounds of marijuana across the desert. He wanted an electrified fence between the U.S.-Mexico border. He's complained white people aren't having enough babies to keep up with the rapid reproduction of minorities. He endorsed a white nationalist running for the mayor of Toronto, and he also met with Austrian far-right political party leaders, a party that was founded by a neo-Nazi. So he's a horrible guy. He was widely abandoned by the Republican Party, and that's why, this is not glorious news. It's great that King has lost, but the person he lost to, Randy Feenstra, is not great. And in fact, what's scary is that Feenstra is running on or ran on. Steve King is not an effective ally for Donald Trump. I can be an effective ally for Donald Trump. And his big issues are to keep the Trump tax cuts, to protect Christian values. Not exactly the best guy. Scary. But hopefully Trump himself will be removed in November and Feenstra won't ever get a chance to serve with Trump. Even better, by the way, is that J.D. Scholten, our friend J.D. Scholten, who unsuccessfully ran to unseat Steve King back in 2018, is running again. So we don't have to see Randy Feenstra win. Let's support J.D. Scholten, great guy, former professional baseball player. I interviewed him back in 2018. He is running again. He is the Democrat running against Randy Feenstra. Let's support him. Excellent, excellent candidate. We'll have continued coverage of yesterday's election results on the David Pakman Show Instagram page. That's David Pakman Show, all one word, on Instagram.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show depends on your support, and the easiest way is through membership, which includes the world-famous bonus show, as well as commercial-free audio and video streams of the show just for members. Sign up today at joinpakman.com. Coupon code saves you 40%. Vote soon 18.
Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Ted Conover, who's an author practicing immersion writing, as well as director of NYU's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. I've actually recommended one or two of Ted's books to my audience in the past. Ted, I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for talking to me.
So there are a lot of people in my audience who may not immediately know what we mean by immersion writing and some of the work that you've done in advance, sometimes for years before you will write a book. Certainly Newjack, where you actually became a correctional officer in order to tell the story of what that's like. In Coyotes, you actually travel across the U.S.-Mexico border with undocumented immigrants and even subsequently work with them in multiple places in the United States. So first, to just kind of frame it, when you start a project like this, what's the genesis of an idea? How do you think about your relationship to the subject matter and start thinking about how you'll carry the project out?
Sure. I guess you could say my approach is to try to go more in depth than a regular journalist can. I look for a subject that matters to people. Maybe it's mass incarceration. Maybe it's immigration, undocumented immigration, or homelessness. And I think, okay, what have journalists and others been able to do to cast light on this topic? And what could I do if I were willing to spend more time and get closer, get my hands dirty if needed? And often the answer has been, I try to go beyond the sort of interview a journalist does, right? Asking the 5 W's and all that, and spend time living with somebody else or doing what they do. So my first book is about railroad tramps, and I was still an undergraduate in college and rode the rails. I met Mexicans while doing that, and using my high school Spanish, realized they would talk to me, and in fact, seemed open to it, and it seemed open to me hanging out. And that became my second book, called Coyotes, which you mentioned. And then, yeah, when I moved to New York from Colorado, gosh, 20 years ago, mass incarceration was all over the news, as it is again today. And I thought, there's got to be a way to get closer to the subject than just, calling up people on the phone or doing interviews. And I ended up applying for a job as a New York State corrections officer, which took about 3 years to get. And then I worked at Sing Sing almost a year for that book. And the idea is, I get closer. I'm not a standard journalist keeping my distance. I'm right in there. And, sometimes distance is good. It lets you be a little more objective, but I tend to get subjective. I say, I'm a CO. I'm scared of this situation, or I'm a CO. The guys around me are angry, and today I understand it. I feel kind of angry myself, and so I try to take notes on what it feels like to be there.
In the book Newjack, and also in some of the research I did preparing for the interview, you talk about the perception that could have been the one that your coworkers at Sing Sing came away with when they learned about the fact that you were researching and ultimately wrote a book about your experience there, that they might be mad at you. They might not like the fact that you essentially, to call it's not a ruse in the sense that you really did go through the training. You really did work there. Nobody knew, you weren't treated differently because there was this book coming at the end of the experience, but that maybe you took advantage in some way that is not okay, or that they would in some way be displeased with the fact that you were there not just as a correctional officer, but also as a writer.
For sure.
Is there a fair critique to be made that you were sort of using the resources of training in order to end up writing a book, or do you find that not to be a fair critique?
Well, you've asked a couple of questions. That last one is, did I, somehow take advantage of the resources of the state of New York just to, just to be able to write something about it? And in fact, I stayed on the job longer than the typical trainee does. Most people drop out before I did, and I stuck with it. So I think New York State got their value from me. I was a good employee. I got good job ratings. I tried really hard to be a good corrections officer and understand what that meant. That's one of two projects which you could call undercover, because I could not tell people my full background or my real agenda, which was to write something about this. The other time I did that, I became a USDA meat inspector at a beef plant in Nebraska, and that was secretive too. And if you do something in a secretive way, you are deceptive, and deception is best avoided in journalism. But there are times when, in order to do something important, I think deception is warranted. Not all journalists agree, but there was no other way I could understand the life of an officer, a guard at Sing Sing, without doing that job. I had previously actually gotten an assignment from the New Yorker to write about COs upstate, and then the state wouldn't let me go to work with them. They would let me visit a single prison once for a short guided tour, but this is a big deal. It's corrections is the second largest employer in New York State, or was when I was a CO, and how do you justify keeping the public out? So I felt justified in getting the job secretly. And then, every journalist faces a moment of reckoning when what they've written comes out, or what they've produced on video. the subjects like it or they don't. And they say it's true or they say that's BS. It's not really different when you've done something undercover. People you write about are still either going to say that's BS or they're going to say, yeah, well, actually, that's true. And far and away, COs said that book is true. It's warts and all. We don't look good in the whole thing, but I got credit for doing the job myself and for telling the truth about it. The most angry was the state of New York, which put out a press release urging aggrieved employees to sue me if they felt I had injured them somehow. And I think the people who felt injured were the state corrections bureaucrats who felt I'd snuck into their prisons and talked about it, which I wasn't supposed to do.
One of the things in Newjack that comes out, which I think couldn't possibly have come out if you were just interviewing people, is the sort of many sides of the prototypical correctional officer, in the sense that there's often conflict about their views of the system. There's conflict about the views on even individual inmates, as some of the stories that you tell. What else was only possible in the telling of that story because you were immersed as a correctional officer that by interviewing people simply could not have been part of the story?
I'm really happy you brought up that example, because to me, that is what this approach lets me do, is look at a big fat stereotype, like the guard as brute or the guard as sadist, and think and ask out loud, how much of that is true? And you're right. I found in some cases, gosh, that guy's pretty bad. But in lots of other cases, in fact, in most cases, what I found was human beings trying to keep something good in themselves alive while being immersed in this negative environment day after day after day. Like, it's a crummy job. It brings out the worst in them. It brought out the worst in me. As my wife observed, it showed her my inner disciplinarian, which I had actually never tried to cultivate. But that's kind of what the job asks you to do, is say no all day long to your fellow human beings. So to get to your question more particularly, working at Sing Sing put me in a group of officers of color. And there's no way I could have learned the things I learned about their lives otherwise. I remember the day I'm talking to the crew I worked with in B Block. It's this giant housing block, more than 600 prisoners. We had like 15 minutes outside the mess hall before we had to start frisking prisoners. And a guy named Alcantara, who's Dominican and lives near New York City, described double parking outside his mom's building because she was moving. And he had his minivan, and he ran inside her lobby to pick something up. And as he's running out, undercover officers, thinking he's part of a drug deal, tackle him. Mm. And I heard a version of this story like 6 different times. These are officers of color I work with who are being pulled over by police on traffic stops, or they're being stopped by undercovers in Harlem because they are people of color. And that makes a big impression, and I wouldn't have been able to tell stories like that had I not done the job myself.
One of the things that I took away from it in hearing, you describe in the book kind of your personality transformation as you describe, and your wife dealing with it, is that maybe there really is more to this idea that the focus on individuals in systems, even now, like with the unrest and protests that we are seeing, the focus on individuals is relevant because people are people as individuals, but we shouldn't ignore the effect that systems have. And that was a really big takeaway for me.
Yeah, the system makes you act a certain way. Let's say you are a person convicted of a crime who has had friends of different races. You're from a place where it was cool making friends who didn't look like you. Well, you go into prison, and that stuff doesn't fly in a lot of prisons. You have to stick with your own kind. Prisons are racially polarized, and then they're ideologically polarized, and they're organized by gang, and so inmates have to act a certain way, and then so do officers. Let's say I'm an officer who thinks it's okay to have a conversation with a prisoner, like just how was
Which
your
you
weekend?
did. I mean, that was something you described. Yeah.
I thought, well, that's a good idea, right? That's how you manage people. You talk to them. There's a whole bunch of officers who think that's a terrible idea, that you're gonna get a reputation as the inmate's friend, right? A guy who won't uphold the rules. And in fact, there were some cases like that where some officers were just too friendly, and you think, whoa, what's that about? Because a certain distance is appropriate. But yeah, you're in this system where your uniform defines how you interact with other people, and you're one of a group of people. Whether you're a prisoner or an officer, you're one of a group, and you have to act in accordance with the standards of that group. And when I see officers now standing shoulder to shoulder to repel demonstrators, I'm always thinking, okay, how many of them are spoiling for a fight? Because you can tell some of them are, right? All of their hearts are beating, bum, 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 bum. They're like, okay, when's it going to start? How long can I restrain myself? Who's going to stick up for me if a rock hits me in the head? But then there's a whole bunch of them who are like, oh my God, let me just get home in one piece and back to my family and my toddler, and right. I didn't really sign up to be in a riot, and but how are those people going to act when it comes to violence? How will they respond to their training with restraint? Will they respond to their their ancient brain and start firing a weapon or flailing with a gun? The whole question of how you act when you're a law enforcement officer and part of a group that's under stress is super important and matters so much today. And so that's kind of the thing I wanted to find out about.
Let's pause the conversation there on our podcast, but we'll have the full conversation with Ted on our YouTube channel.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show depends on the support of our viewers and listeners, and one way to keep us going is through Patreon, where you can pledge as little as $1 per month or as much as you want at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Great perks and benefits as well. Read about them.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I have some stunning tweets for you today of Donald Trump actually blaming the guy in the White House for protests happening around our country. Now, of course, the guy in the White House when Trump was doing this was named Barack Obama, and Trump will never actually take responsibility when it's him. But it is another example of just the blistering hypocrisy. So back in 2014, there were protests in the United States over the killing of black teenager Michael Brown. Donald Trump tweeted just a treasure trove of attacks on Barack Obama for those protests, including, quote, "Our country is totally fractured, and with our weak leadership in Washington, you can expect Ferguson-type riots and looting in other places." Trump also tweeting, and this one is extra special, "Can you imagine what Putin and all of our friends and enemies throughout the world are saying about the U.S. as they watch the Ferguson riot? Well, imagine what they're saying now as we have a level of unrest that makes what happened around Ferguson look like child's play, while Donald Trump's suggestion is bring in the military to repress protests even more aggressively. What are they saying right now? Well, we know what they're saying. And we've heard from a number of those leaders, including Canada's Justin Trudeau, and they're horrified. Another Trump tweet, quote, as China and the rest of the world continue to rip off the U.S. economically, they laugh at us and our president over the riots in Ferguson. Again, what are they doing right now? Now, of course, this time around, when the civil unrest is orders of magnitude bigger than what we had in 2014, it's combined with a 100-year pandemic. Suddenly, none of it has anything to do with Donald Trump. It's everybody else's fault in this case. Now, I told you yesterday that Donald Trump's strategy has ironically been CCCP, just a coincidence that those are the initials, CCCP. And what this means is confuse about what's actually happening in our country. That's step one. Number two, conflate. And Trump has been conflating, and so has Kayleigh McEnany and other Trumpists, conflate protesters, looters, rioters, and inciters. Criticize, and this means pass the buck, pass the blame to governors, to Democrats, to protesters, to whoever else Trump can blame. And then lastly, the P in CCCP is to pander to his Trumpist base, much of which loves authoritarianism. And that, we're going to have a voicemail later on about the hypocrisy. But, all of these people who claim to support Trump and who are owning guns because they fear a tyrannical government will be swept in and they will need their rifles to defend themselves, they are saying very little about the deployment of state National Guards, about Donald Trump's threat to deploy federal military assets to states, in contrast or in opposition to what it is that governors are asking for. And the really sad and tragic thing about this approach is that many of his followers have fallen for the idea that anything good that happens is thanks to Trump, and anything bad that happens is somebody else's fault. If you can blame Obama, that's great. If you can blame Democrats, if you can blame China, if you can blame the so-called fake news media, that's all great. So what we need right now, what we lack is leadership, empathy, understanding, and a really steady hand at times like these. Trump can't lead. Trump has no empathy. Trump doesn't understand so many things. And he has the opposite of a steady hand. He has a completely erratic hand. Trump is telling cops, don't be too nice. Trump is telling governors, you guys are jerks. Trump is calling the protesters thugs. Trump is conflating Antifa and protesters. And I did want to say one other thing about the blaming of governors. Notice that it is now a regular for Donald Trump, on coronavirus, when it became impossible to defend his failed testing protocol. He said, really, testing is up to the governors in the end. They've got to figure out how to test enough people for coronavirus. It's the same thing now. He is saying it's the weak governors who aren't being tough enough with the protesters. Blaming weak governors from the White House and on Twitter is like an arsonist blaming firefighters for not putting out a fire that they started. It makes absolutely no sense. We are dealing with protests over police brutality. And Trump's big idea after a weekend of silence is to say, hey, let's be more brutal with the protesters. And then he blames governors for not doing so. It's all backwards, my friends. It's all completely and utterly backwards. And it's why we have to end it in November. We have to talk about this talking point being used by some on the right and even some on the left about so-called outside protesters in the civil unrest that we're seeing across the country right now in dozens of urban areas. So I'm going to tell you what's being said. I'm going to tell you the truth. And then I'm going to tell you what the most important takeaway is from all of this, which is that it doesn't actually matter if protesters are coming from so-called the outside. So the right regularly talks about so-called outside protesters because their priority is to make it seem like there's not really a concern in our country about police brutality in the communities where the protests are happening. So when the right insists the protesters are coming from outside the city, from somewhere else, they can disqualify and ignore the activism that is actually motivating protesters. And they can say, you know, these are provocateurs, these are looters and rioters, burglars, people who are there for nefarious reasons. But most importantly, what they want to argue by saying people are coming in from outside the cities is they want to argue that not that many people are actually concerned about police brutality, which was the catalyst for these protests. You've also got a little slice of the left where you've seen the outside protesters talking point used in the context of framing outsiders as the right-wing astroturf, whether it's white nationalists pretending to be Antifa, or in order to make Antifa and protesters kind of amorphous or look bad or whatever else. You're seeing less of it, but it's still also not the best thing, because here's the truth. Number one, in terms of those getting arrested, the reports that we've seen are that most of the arrests are people who live in the cities or metro areas where the protests are happening. So in Minnesota, there was a report about 20% of the arrests were outsiders. In Detroit, similar numbers, about 80% of the arrests were from the Detroit metro area. So first of all, it is factually untrue that a huge number, at least of the troublemakers, are from outside areas. But here are the two really important takeaways. First of all, it would make sense that the troublemakers, politics aside, are from the outside. Why? Well, there's that phrase about dogs don't go to the bathroom where they eat or something like that. Intuitively, of course, people are more likely to cause trouble and destroy stuff where they don't live. It says nothing about motive or justification for the protests whatsoever, but it makes sense that you're more likely to destroy a place that you don't actually live in. But here's the most important takeaway. Who cares if they're coming from the outside? You can still care about police brutality if you come into a city from somewhere else. Mass rallies happen in urban centers and population centers. Protests happen where there are people. If you live in northern rural Indiana, there aren't any sizable protests there because there's such little population density. It makes perfect sense that you would head into Chicago, for example, to be part of a larger protest. It doesn't mean you don't care about police brutality. It doesn't mean you're there to commit a crime or to attack people or to loot. It just means people are protesting where there are people. So I was reminded of this debate that happened around Barack Obama. Is he really a Christian or is he some kind of secret Muslim? And at some point, Colin Powell came out and said, the question of whether he is or is not Muslim is irrelevant. Muslims can still be president. It would change nothing about his policies if he were Muslim. And in the same way here, there is nothing invalid about protesters from out of town. Much of this country is very rural. The protests are limited to a few dozen large urban areas. Of course, you're going to have people from different places in cities protesting because that's where the protests are taking place. So we've got to take back this talking point. We can't allow the right or the left to miss the forest for the trees, just arguing about the protesters are from in or out of the city. The looters are from in or out of the city. People are going to cities because that's where the protests are happening, and there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, here's an interesting voicemail. Our number is 219-2-DAVID-P with a very interesting question about where are all those Obama is going to declare martial law people right now?
Hey, David. I just wanted to say that remember a few years ago when Obama was president?
Yeah.
And you had all those right-wingers saying that he was going to declare martial law and take away people's guns and
yes.
unleash the black helicopters and all that nonsense.
Right.
Well, where are those people now? Like, I don't get how they could see what's happening now and not be against it.
Oh, I see how. It was always partisan hackery. They never really care about that stuff. It's very, very simple. They're not complaining now about Trump because when they see, oh, Trump is going to come out and repress protests with the military, they like it. They like it. It was never about principles. It was never about suspending habeas corpus or whatever it was that they said. It was just partisan politics, and it's being very boldly exposed right now. We have a great bonus show for you today. We will talk about bicycles becoming the new toilet paper. They are flying off the shelves during the coronavirus pandemic and much more. Don't miss today's bonus show. Get instant access by becoming a member at joinpacman.com. And remember, every day, The David Pakman Show audio podcast is available. Get it on Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play Podcasts, iTunes, wherever you want. Don't miss the podcast, and we will see you on the bonus show. Thanks so much for watching today's episode. Just a reminder, today's sponsor, Blue Chew, is giving you your first shipment completely free. All you have to do is pay $5 shipping. Go to bluechew.com and use the promo code DAVID. I've put a link right underneath this video.